listening to Horns of a Dilemma. My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the publisher of the Texas National Security Review. This episode is a great talk with Sarah Snyder of the School of International Service at American University. She's talking about her book, From Selma to Moscow, which is about how human rights activists transform U.S. foreign policy. She was hosted by the Clement Center and the LBJ School Research Colloquium down at UT.
Will you all please help me welcome Dr. Sarah Snyder?
Hello. I want to thank you all for coming, and I wanted to just say that it's really wonderful to be here speaking about this project at the LBJ School because, as I note in the acknowledgments, the entire book was the product of an invitation from Mark Lawrence, who was organizing a conference with Frank Gavin to talk about Lyndon Johnson's foreign policy beyond Vietnam. And he said, have you done anything about human rights and Lyndon Johnson? And I said, no. But I thought, is there anything about Lyndon Johnson and human rights? And that sent me off to the LBJ Library. The LBJ Foundation supported my research at the library and at multiple other presidential libraries to go into this book. And so I'm just so delighted to be back here, sort of where the project all began, talking about this project. Now we're going to fast forward into a bit more contemporary events. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, speaking to State Department employees in May of 2017, argued that promoting values, quote, creates obstacles to our ability to advance our national security interests and our economic interests. Now, Tillerson outlined a challenge that has confronted U.S. presidents for decades, balancing values and national security. Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and their successors each made calculated decisions about human rights. And they also debated the best means of advancing human rights. But over the course of their administrations, none of these presidents argued that human rights had no place in U.S. foreign policy. Instead, each believed that the United States' support for human rights signaled the country's distinctiveness, and each recognized that such efforts generated considerable soft power. Pursuing a foreign policy that ignored human rights would mark a return to an earlier transactional approach. And it was this approach in the 1970s that led members of Congress to ensure that human rights became and remained a component of foreign policy. In the mid-1970s, Congress passed a series of reforms to ensure that the United States would no longer be in the business of supporting regimes that violated the universal values enshrined in international commitments such as the 1948 UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And From Selma to Moscow illuminates how Americans' human rights activism culminated in these reforms. Therefore, what I want to talk about today is the Americans who advocated for greater attention to human rights in the long 1960s and show how their activism inspired the institutionalization of human rights in U.S. foreign policy. A Foreign Service officer, Philip Habib, traveled to South Korea in 1962 to serve as political counselor. And during his 3 years there, Habib remembers, quote, I used to play poker with the prime minister every Sunday afternoon. I knew everybody in the country. Habib would build upon and extend those connections when he returned to Seoul as the American ambassador in 1971. As Stanley Zuckerman, who was the information officer and press attaché between 1971 and 1973 in the U.S. Embassy in Seoul, remembers that how his friends who were journalists might be arrested by the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, and they would suffer torture for printing what the KCIA deemed to be unacceptable stories. Now, as Zuckerman recalls it, Habib, who knew many of these journalists through, among other things, regular poker games, communicated firmly that press repression was a strong irritant in our relationship. Now, a brazen attack by South Korean leader Park Chung-hee's regime precipitated even more forceful involvement by Habib. On August 8, 1973, South Korean agents kidnapped opposition politician Kim Dae-jung from his room at Tokyo's Grand Palace Hotel. He was driven to Osaka and put on a high-speed boat. And restrained with weights, Kim expected to be tossed into the sea. Instead, Habib and Japanese diplomats made forceful appeals to the South Korean government to save Kim's life. And officials in Washington issued a statement calling for his release, which occurred in Seoul 5 days later. Donald Gregg, who was the CIA station chief in Seoul when Kim was kidnapped, said, Habib made a representation to the Korean government saying that it is your own agency that has done this, and you damn well better keep him alive or it will do huge damage to our relations. Habib's activism on human rights continued after he returned to Washington to serve as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs, and he sought there to draw high-level attention to problems in South Korea by, for example, speaking about the issue at length in a meeting with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and other senior State Department staff. Habib sought a re-evaluation of American objectives in South Korea, arguing, quote, "When faced with the reality of oppression, I think the United States has to make clear that it's not on the side of oppression, that it doesn't condone it." Kissinger, however, was not convinced that POC's human rights abuses could produce instability that might threaten U.S. interests. In a classic expression of his human rights position, Kissinger said, "First, in general, I've tried to abolish the political science department in the State Department, which tries to restructure the domestic situations of other countries, especially allies, because either we're involved because we have American interests or we shouldn't be involved at all." He said, "I don't think it's worth our investment to democratize Korea." Now, Habib, who spent 6 years in South Korea between 1961 and 1974, was deeply connected to South Koreans through his professional and personal ties. And these connections, along with longstanding concerns about political and religious repression based on his family's history, led Habib to press for the rights of individual South Koreans who were facing abuses under POC, as well as to urge American pressure on POC to alleviate human rights conditions more broadly. Habib stretched the parameters of his official role to address human rights concerns when possible. And I think that his case illuminates the complicated role of diplomats in shaping and implementing U.S. policy. It also demonstrates how transnational connections shaped the human rights activism of lower-level and non-state actors in these years. Habib is one of a number of activists that I highlight in my book, From Selma to Moscow: How Human Rights Activists Transformed U.S. Policy, or U.S. Foreign Policy. The book examines how Americans responded to human rights violations in 5 countries across the long 1960s. And in each chapter, I highlight a key non-state or lower-level actor. And I want to just talk about 2 more of these actors in order to emphasize the diverse ways in which they influenced U.S. foreign policy. So traveling to Europe in 1958, American James Beckett met a Greek woman, Maria, who became his wife. They later settled in Geneva, where news of the 1967 Greek coup reached them. And news of this coup and the subsequent repression in Greece spurred the 2 of them to action. I would say that Beckett emphasizes that his personal background, not only his marriage to Maria, primed him to become active on Greece. Now, Beckett highlights his time spent in Chile in the 1950s and 1960s, as well as attending Harvard Law School at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, as shaping his political views. In the wake of the coup, James and Maria reached out to Amnesty International, as well as he puts it, everyone else who might be interested. The 2 of them met with Amnesty International's head, Sean McBride, and McBride proposed a mission to Greece. The Beckett's goal was to get greater attention for the repression in Greece. As James puts it, they were engaged in a battle for public opinion in Europe and in America. And Beckett went on to co-author Amnesty International's first report on torture in Greece, which argued that, quote, "Torture as a deliberate practice is carried out by the security police and the military police." And this report also went on to detail 5 different physical methods that were being used to torture political prisoners. Now, Amnesty's reporting inspired a range of governmental and non-governmental actors to oppose ongoing U.S. support for the regime, and it was instrumental in keeping attention focused on human rights abuses in Greece. The Beckett family involvement even extended to James's mother, Elise, who was based in Lakeville, Connecticut. And actually, one of the principal questions motivating my early research was, why does Elise Beckett from Lakeville, Connecticut, care so much about human rights? Because as I traveled around the country, going to all of these different sort of collections of the personal papers of members of Congress, I kept finding letters from Elise Beckett. Because as part of her activism, she kept writing to members of Congress about what was happening in Greece. And according to her son, James, she even took her lobbying directly to Congress, roller skating around the halls there to be an even more efficient advocate. The final person I want to talk about today is Joseph Eldredge, who became one of the Washington Office on Latin America, or WOLA's longtime leaders, after serving as a Methodist missionary in Chile for several years before the 1973 coup. Now, Eldredge's path to human rights activism began in segregated Tennessee. It built upon a growing consciousness about race that he developed during his university years. It manifested itself in protests against segregation and the war in Vietnam. And it was influenced by liberation theology and his missionary training experiences. As a missionary in Chile, Eldredge worked with others who were concerned about U.S. corporate and government influence there. Now, after the coup and the arrest of 2 Maryknoll seminarians with whom he worked, Eldredge left the country. Back in the United States, Eldredge was drawn into working with WOLA by his opposition to the Nixon administration's actions in Chile. But I would say that he was also particularly motivated by knowing victims of Pinochet's repression personally. Now, his objective with WOLA was to influence U.S. policy toward Latin America. To this end, Eldredge remembers that he talked regularly with journalists that he hoped to influence, he introduced them to Latin American dissidents, and he shared leads with them. He also monitored congressional hearings, he collected information, and he met regularly with members of Congress and their staff. Now, in addition, WOLA organized a trip for members of Congress to Chile in March of 1976. Representatives Tom Harkin, George Miller, and Toby Moffett, who were Democrats from Iowa, California, and Connecticut, respectively, traveled with Eldredge to Chile. Now, Harkin had a particularly eventful visit, and this is because he and Eldredge managed to get inside the Villa Grimaldi, which was an infamous torture center, before being quickly removed by Chilean security forces. Upon their return, the 3 members of Congress issued a joint statement that declared, "During our stay, it became increasingly clear that the junta, with all the sincerity and conviction imaginable, rules nonetheless by terror. We found a silent and pervasive fear in all segments of Chilean society, the oldest of Latin American democracies." Through this congressional delegation and other avenues, Eldredge was able to press for greater attention to and action on Chilean human rights violations. In Eldredge's view, what WOLA did was to, quote, take a prophetic view of Latin America and translate it into the clinical language of Washington, the language of legislation and of lobbying. In the book, I also analyze growing American attention to and activism on behalf of repressed Soviet citizens, including by Washington Senator Henry Jackson. I also demonstrate how Southern Rhodesia's 1965 unilateral Declaration of Independence spurred civil rights leaders in the United States and others concerned with racial discrimination, such as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Arthur J. Goldberg, to urge Lyndon Johnson's administration to undermine the white regime. I explore how, in the case of Greece, the junta's harsh treatment of its perceived enemies in the wake of the 1967 coup galvanized many Americans, including Beckett. I examine how frustrations with U.S. policy toward South Korea, expressed by Habib and others, led to efforts to curb military and economic assistance to Seoul. I analyze how the 1973 military coup in Chile and subsequent human rights violations there motivated non-governmental activists and members of Congress, people like Eldredge and Harkin, to press for greater distance from the repressive government. In each case, activists and members of Congress attempted to utilize their available tools, but they were often stymied by the White House. And their growing frustration produced a congressional revolution that laid the foundation for the institutionalization of human rights as a priority in U.S. foreign policy. And therefore, the final chapter explores the 1973 hearings on human rights held by Representative Donald Frazier and his House Subcommittee on International Organizations and Movements that fundamentally recalibrated U.S. foreign policy formulation. This is because the subcommittee's hearings precipitated a wave of legislation that reshaped the State Department's bureaucracy and formalized human rights as a factor in U.S. policy. And these efforts laid the foundation for the issue's continuing significance in the years that followed. So to answer such questions as, what did human rights mean to Americans in the 1960s and 1970s, or why did Americans come to care about human rights, and what tactics did they perceive as the best means to achieve their agenda, I conducted research in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Chile, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. I would say the most fruitful research was done in the personal papers of members of Congress, but also the archives of non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International, the International League for the Rights of Man, and the American Civil Liberties Union were all useful to me. I also relied upon oral histories with American diplomats. That's how I found out about sort of Habib and his regular poker games. But I was also fortunate to conduct personal interviews with people like Beckett, Eldridge, Fraser, and others. National Security Council and State Department records were useful in assessing how external pressure was experienced inside the executive branch by US policymakers. But I also found unanticipated interventions by the Secretaries of Defense and Treasury. And so that broadened the types of records that I used. So the countries upon which the first 5 chapters of the book are based, and this is the Soviet Union, Southern Rhodesia, Greece, South Korea, and Chile, were each selected after extensive examination of the records of the relevant presidential administrations, the State Department, Congress, the UN, and NGOs. And I argue that the 5 countries that I selected had the human rights records of most interest to all of these constituencies at the time. They also represent diversity in terms of geography, in terms of ideology, and the types of human rights that were being violated. Now, certainly we know that there were other countries, such as Iran or China, that had widespread human rights violations. But for a number of reasons, these actually sparked little outrage within the United States. I would say that South Africa did warrant significant interest at the time, but in my view, it had already received significant scholarly attention, and so I didn't include it in this book. Before I go on, I just want to give you sort of a few definitions. And one is how I'm employing the term human rights. And what I'm doing is using it as the activists that I studied did at the time, to signal support for the rights to due process, the right to practice one's religion, freedom of movement, and participation in one's own government, as well as freedom from racial discrimination and torture. So to use shorthand, they were largely attentive to civil and political rights, not the fuller list of human rights outlined in the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And when I use the term long 1960s, I'm talking about the years between John F. Kennedy's inauguration in 1961 and Jimmy Carter's in 1977. In my view, the long 1960s was a distinctive period in that domestically it was characterized by the height of the civil rights movement and other rights-based movements, as well as the movement to end US involvement in Vietnam, all of which collectively reshaped American politics and society. And in terms of foreign policy, the long 1960s were marked not only by the war in Vietnam, but also by increasing challenges to US power in the Third World and efforts to reduce tension with the Soviet Union amid unrelenting Cold War competition. I think one signal of how the long 1960s was distinct is in the increased use of the term human rights. Now here I've used the New York Times as an example. And what the graph shows is that the term human rights was used on average 2.4 times more per year during the long 1960s than during the 8 years of the Eisenhower administration that preceded it. Furthermore, the incidence of human rights more than doubled between 1961 and 1976, although, of course, there are clearly fluctuations over time. So now I'm going to return to the sort of principal argument of the book. What led Americans to care about international violations of human rights? Well, previous accounts have largely focused on the 1970s as a period of emerging concern about human rights abuses, whether as the result of Jimmy Carter's election, guilt over the war in Vietnam, or failed political utopias. In contrast, I identify transnational connections and the social movements of the long 1960s as the foundation for this human rights activism in the United States. Now, the long 1960s was a decade of decreasing costs for international travel and increasing advances in television and satellite communication. The 1960s offered new opportunities for Americans to travel and work abroad. And returning Peace Corps volunteers, missionaries, and academics were often attracted to human rights activism by the transnational connections they made during their international experiences. The Americans motivated by transnational connections or other impulses, such as Habib, Beckett, and Eldridge, were entrepreneurs in a growing movement for human rights in these years. While other Americans were drawn to human rights activism through broader changes that were taking place internationally and within the United States in the long 1960s, and these together primed them to care about human rights violations. Internationally, decolonization increased the demands on the United States to take greater account of racial discrimination, both in its own practices and in its foreign policy. And in addition, at the international and domestic levels, there was increasing influence for NGOs, some of which focused on human rights. And this all worked together to influence growing American activism. Now, in terms of the social movements that were influential for these activists, domestically, the movements for African American freedom and against the war in Vietnam shaped Americans' thinking about the policies of their government and led many to push for new approaches to human rights in U.S. policy. Displeasure with the conduct of U.S. foreign policy, including not only the war in Vietnam, but also the 1965 intervention in the Dominican Republic, support for military dictatorships, and covert intelligence operations abroad, all corroded the Cold War consensus that had privileged containment and anti-communism over other priorities. Now, although non-state actors have always played influential roles in shaping U.S. foreign relations, changes in the 1960s opened space for them to have an enhanced role in policymaking, which for some time had been dominated by a closed elite group who subscribed to a consensus view of U.S. policy. So as this consensus weakened, members of Congress asserted themselves more forcefully in the policymaking process, and at times used their control of the appropriations process to wield greater influence. The breakdown of the Cold War consensus also produced a degree of democratization in foreign policymaking. And this book shows how activists, lawyers, and religious leaders involved in human rights work seized these new opportunities to shape U.S. foreign policy. As the political scientist Michael Nelson has pointed out, narratives about the 1960s have often emphasized turbulence, division, and potential crisis. And these ruptures, I would argue, offered opportunities to human rights activists. Support for human rights was also closely linked with domestic concerns about civil, political, economic, and social rights during the 1960s. But I would say that these 1960s era social movements were not just an inspiration to Americans who were concerned about human rights, but they also gave them a license to criticize other countries' human rights records. During the Eisenhower years, Americans had been aware that their country's record on race relations left it open to considerable criticism. In the 1960s, as the United States made strides through court decisions like Brown versus Board of Education, protests to end segregation, and the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act, as well as greater visibility of African Americans in public life, criticism of the American race record at the UN declined, and United States policymakers gained greater confidence in talking about human rights violations abroad. Put another way, as the United States made more progress on the fulfillment of civil rights domestically, it was better situated to contribute internationally regarding human rights. Fundamentally, the civil rights movement wanted the federal government to protect Americans from violations of their rights. That thinking led by extension to a belief that the United States could play a similar role in protecting people from violations abroad, whether in Southern Rhodesia, South Africa, Greece, or elsewhere. In many ways, human rights activists were building upon the successes of the civil rights movement, in that white and Black liberals sought to export the movement's victories abroad. And the book's title, From Selma to Moscow, evokes that impulse. Liberal Jews participated in the campaign for racial equality in the United States, and their efforts also went toward trying to enable the emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union. And there were a lot of interconnections in their work. And I think that that can really be seen in this sign, which is from a March 1965 rally held in Philadelphia on behalf of Soviet Jews. And as you can see, the sign says, Selma or Moscow, human liberty is indivisible, end Soviet anti-Semitism. So the movement for greater protection of African Americans' rights generally heightened Americans' attention to human rights language, to the plight of those oppressed by illiberal leaders, and specifically to the oppression of Black Africans who suffered under colonialism and white minority regimes. Although rights have been significant to the United States all the way since the country's founding, it was really in the 1960s that we see an explosion of demands for new rights. The historian Brian Below suggests, quote, "The civil rights movement provided the how-to guide to would-be organizers, as activists from civil rights moved on to the New Left, feminist, and even the environmental movements." I would say that human rights activists were also inspired by, students of, and in some cases participants in the civil rights movement. One notable example of this shift from civil rights work to human rights work is the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. This committee began in response to John F. Kennedy's call to bring a legal approach to the civil rights movement. But later, the committee went on to defending South Africans who were charged under apartheid legislation. So I've spent most of my time talking about the inspiration for human rights activism, the transnational connections and the social movements. I want to talk about the two other things that I see as distinctive in U.S. human rights activism in the long 1960s. One, the focus of that activism, and then two, the adoption of a new language to express activists' concerns. So focus. If we look at sort of the longer history of US-based human rights activism, we'll see that since the late 1940s, human rights groups had been headquartered in New York City, where with UN observer status, they could direct their attention to UN bodies and UN diplomats. And just to give you one example, I think the International League for the Rights of Man's model of operating was really standard for the time. What they said that they sought to do was to, quote, "bring violations to the attention of a particular government through its ambassador in Washington or its mission at the UN. If no reply was forthcoming or if it was inadequate, then they would press the matter further by bringing it to the attention of the Secretary General of the UN or to the press and the world community." And so I think it's notable that in July of 1967, the International League for the Rights of Man instead outlined a plan for more assertively tackling human rights violations that moved beyond just corresponding with foreign diplomats and that shifted its attention away from New York. And this culminated in 1975 with the League creating a lawyers' committee in Washington to enhance its effectiveness in achieving the organization's agenda. In a similar move, the U.S. section of Amnesty International, which had been headquartered in New York City going back into the mid-1960s, opened a Washington office in 1976. And I think that moving the geographic focus of American human rights activism from New York to Washington reveals a deep frustration with the effectiveness of the UN as a forum for addressing human rights violations. And this frustration led advocates, not only in the United States, I've seen this with Soviet dissidents as well, to lose faith in the UN as a body through which human rights violations, or through which human rights could be protected. Instead, in the long 1960s, non-state and lower-level actors saw the United States as the U.S. government as the entity that could have the greatest effect on human rights violations abroad. Their vision located the United States, both its values and its power, at the center of the international system. And I think that such a vision really illuminates how these Americans conceived of their role in foreign policymaking and how they conceived of the role of the United States in the world in the 1960s. So now turning to language. The long 1960s was a period in which Americans who fought against racial discrimination, U.S. support for repressive regimes, and the use of torture came to adopt the common lexicon of human rights to describe their activism. Just to give you, I'm going to give you two examples. In the first one, Joseph Eldridge, who I showed you earlier, who was a missionary who became a human rights activist, said, before the Fraser Report, and this was the report that came out of Fraser's 1973 hearings, he said, "I didn't think of what I was doing as human rights work." And similarly, Ronald Palmer, who was a longtime State Department official, remembers that in the middle of 1975, he was asked to join a team that was working on something called human rights. And I think the fact that in the middle of 1975, he wasn't really even sure what human rights was, suggests the term was still incredibly novel within the State Department's officialdom. So why is this all important? Well, I think that why Americans came to care about human rights in the 1960s is important because the reasons for this activism guided the solutions that they desired and that they achieved. The human rights violations at the center of my account, torture, racial discrimination, religious persecution, drove American citizens and NGOs to exert pressure through letter writing, testifying before Congress, and participating in demonstrations, among other activities. The members of Congress who came to care about human rights, they held hearings to investigate human rights violations, they published reports highlighting human rights abuses, And when their concerns were largely dismissed by the executive branch, they tried to end military and economic assistance to governments that abuse their citizens' rights. To this end, Congress first took incremental steps to curb assistance to specific countries, and then they shifted to sort of more generally targeting repressive governments. So first, in 1971, Congress voted to cut off aid to Greece, which was about $117 million at this point. 5 years later, Congress decreased military assistance to South Korea considerably to only $55 million. And in 1976, Congress banned all military assistance, credits, and cash sales of military equipment to Chile without any exceptions or loopholes. There had been exceptions and loopholes in some of the previous legislation. So after this targeted legislation, then Congress began to work on more comprehensive attempts to limit U.S. support for abusive regimes. And we see that in 1975 with the passage of the Harkin Amendment, or Section 116 of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, which prevented the extension of economic aid to governments that engaged in gross violations of human rights unless, quote, such assistance will directly benefit the needy people of such country. The next year, Congress passed Section 301 of the International Security Assistance and Arms Control Export Control Act. And this section dictated that the United States could not extend any security assistance to countries that engaged in a pattern of gross violations of human rights, except under specified circumstances. So in order to judge if those specified circumstances were met, the State Department would need to compile full and complete reports on each country that received security assistance. This is the legislation that mandated that the State Department produce annual human rights country reports. And in the first year, the State Department produced 17 of them. Eventually, Congress also passed legislation regarding the bureaucratic organization of the State Department that led to the appointment of an Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, and led to the establishment of a bureau with the same name in 1977. I would say when faced with this activism from members of Congress and non-state actors, presidential administrations in the long 1960s responded in a range of ways to this external pressure and internal concerns about human rights violations. There were regular in-house debates about the proper course of U.S. policy, with lower-level State Department officials, people like Habib, often arguing for more action in the face of resistance at the highest levels. And I would say when there was action, frequently it was undertaken by American diplomats overseas or mid-level officials who expressed unease about human rights violations to foreign governments. Now, Henry Kissinger was the driving force of U.S. foreign policy during the Nixon and Ford years, and his long-held perspective, which was shared by many policymakers at the time, was that protecting human rights was not central to his U.S. foreign policy priorities. And this meant that supporters of human rights had a challenging task when it came to shaping U.S. policy, but I would say that they succeeded in the long 1960s in some important ways. Habib and other State Department officials, whether in Washington or serving as diplomats overseas, were far more attentive to and concerned about human rights than previous Kissinger-centered studies have recognized. I would say that State Department officials under Kissinger designated human rights officers in regional bureaus and appointed other officials to work on human rights in the functional bureaus of the State Department. Now, importantly, all of those active on human rights heightened awareness about violations such that decisions to support repressive regimes led to congressional hearings, front-page news, and some successes in reducing the flow of U.S. dollars into their coffers. In addition, the country overall became increasingly attuned to the potential impact of U.S. foreign policy on human rights practices abroad. And these efforts elevated human rights among broader American audiences. I would say that the issue's increasing salience can be seen in polls that show that by 1974, 67% of Americans agreed strongly or somewhat with the statement that, quote, the United States should pressure countries which systematically violate basic human rights. Also, 73% of Americans strongly or somewhat agreed that it was morally wrong for the United States to support military dictators that violate their citizens' rights. So to conclude, why did Philip Habib or James Beckett, Joseph Eldridge, Henry Jackson, Arthur Goldberg, and Donald Frazier take action in support of human rights. Each of them came to human rights activism through personal and often transnational connections, because the long 1960s were a period in which the relationship between Americans and their government transformed in many ways. I think even more significant, as Harry Frankfurt has written, quote, "There are occasions when a person realizes that he cares about what matters to him not merely so much, but in such a way that it is impossible for him to forbear from a certain course of action." And I think that this is what motivated people like Habib and Beckett. They could no longer forbear with US support for these repressive governments. According to the sociologist Charles Tilly, social movements depend heavily on political entrepreneurs for their scale, durability, and effectiveness. And these individuals that I've talked about today became the entrepreneurs for human rights activism in the United States. And to achieve greater attention for human rights, they engaged in contentious politics, to use Tilly and Sidney Taro's language. As entrepreneurs, Habib, Beckett, Eldridge, and Fraser galvanized other Americans to work alongside them in pressing for greater attention to human rights in US foreign policy. And these activists became part of a broader transnational social movement devoted to human rights. The book ends just before Jimmy Carter's inauguration in 1977. Which seemed at the time to represent a culmination of these human rights activists' efforts. But I think with a longer view, From Selma to Moscow is an instructive rather than a triumphal tale. And this is because in the years since the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, debates taking place within Washington and elsewhere have revealed that the place of human rights in U.S. foreign policy remains contested. Debated by presidents, his lawyers, members of Congress, NGOs such as Human Rights Watch and the ACLU, as well as the American public. And this is because not only did the United States increasingly collaborate with repressive governments in the wake of 9/11, but the country also became an abuser of human rights. Now, considerable progress has been made since then. The United States no longer tortures or operates covert prisons, but many troubling policies remain, including rendition, the indefinite detention of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, and the use of drone warfare. Similarly, if the Trump administration continues on the course that Tillerson outlined in those remarks in May of 2017, I think they will undermine the country's standing internationally and endanger U.S. interests. And this is because abandoning human rights as a priority in U.S. foreign policy threatens U.S. security. I think that such an approach risks heightening anti-Americanism in an already hostile world. And in my view, resentment will grow if the United States chooses short-term stability or support for repressive dictators over long-term commitments to democracy and human rights. Finally, disavowing human rights undermines our national identity. But I think that fortunately there are several factors that will slow or impede this administration's efforts to shift U.S. foreign policy so fundamentally. And first, this is because popular support for human rights remains high among Americans. In 2015, 77% of Americans polled asserted that the United States should be, quote, the world's leader in promoting human rights. Second, the institutionalization of human rights in foreign policy, which I describe in the book, makes this process very difficult to reverse. This is because so many of the attempts to ensure attention to human rights are embedded in congressional legislation, and congressional support for human rights endures. Finally, violations of human rights inspire substantial activism, and NGOs such as Human Rights Watch and Human Rights First devote considerable resources to making sure that the public's attention remains focused on these issues. I think that what From Selma to Moscow shows us is that the challenges facing 1960s-era activists, in particular how to balance morality and adherence to American values with the preservation of national security, as well as how to advance a policy agenda that is resisted by the White House, have continuing relevance for U.S. foreign policy today. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.